朋友们，大家好，欢迎来到飞时财经。今天我们要深度剖析一个极其震撼的真相。此时此刻的川普正站在一个深渊的边缘。大家最近可能在各大平台上看到过一些极具煽动性的震撼新闻，比如传闻因为国债利息暴增，某位美联储央行高官已经称病遁逃。虽然这种基于恐慌的坊间传闻带有一定的戏剧色彩，但它真实折射出的是美国经济决策层面对彻底失控的财政黑洞时那种无路可逃的瘫痪状态。以他们为代表的美国金融利益集团在政策和战略上已经彻底破产，他们面前的美国经济就像一架引擎全部老化却必须全速飞行的客机，已经步入了必死无疑的最后阶段。今天我们将通过极其详实的最新客观数据和深度的实证剖析，撕开这层虚假的繁荣面纱，看看这个曾经的超级大国是如何在内部崩塌的。美国联邦政府的资产负债表已经演变成了一个彻底失去数学约束的黑洞，这不是经济周期带来的短暂赤字，而是结构性的、无可挽回的国家破产。截至2026年中，美国国债规模已经飙升至39万亿美元的恐怖高位。根据美国国会预算办公室发布的最新基线预测，到2036年，公众持有的联邦债务占国内生产总值的比例将达到创纪录的 120%， 彻底打破二战后 106% 的历史极值。在没有爆发世界大战或全球性大萧条的当前，预算办公室预计本财年的联邦赤字依然高达 1.9 万亿美元，占国内生产总值的 5.8%。在和平繁荣时期维持如此庞大的赤字率，在人类经济学历史上是极其罕见且致命的。最具破坏力的数据在于债务成本。本财年，美国政府仅用于支付国债利息的净支出就已经突破1万亿美元，这意味着利息支出已经正式超越了美国一直以来引以为傲的国防预算，成为仅次于社保和医疗的联邦最大开支。政府收上来的国民税收中越来越大的一块只能拿来给华尔街和海外债主支付利息，这直接锁死了美国未来进行实体基建或民生投资的任何财政空间，这是一个毫无指望的死局。作为一个曾经在美国真实生活和工作过的人，我对这种内部的腐朽与崩塌有着切肤之痛。今天必须和大家做一次现身说法。很多人被美国庞大宣传机器塑造的自由市场幻象迷惑了，但我在那里亲眼所见，美国庞大的官僚体制、军工复合体以及核心金融垄断寡头内部，实际上早就固化成了一种变相的终身雇佣利益共同体。这些高高在上的既得利益者盘根错节，占据着最核心的社会资源，却没有任何刺激活力可言，每天只是在空转和吸血，疯狂消耗国家的财富。这种系统性的僵化直接导致了国家创新能力和竞争力的丧失。由于这种僵化和腐败，加上恶劣的通胀环境，如今外资活钱正在大量撤离美国本土市场。根据美国经济分析局2025年第一季度公布的最新权威数据，新增外资对美国股权的投资出现了惊人的断崖式暴跌，降幅高达 62.5%， 外国直接投资也暴跌了 33.7%。 纽约美联储近期更是发出严重警告，指出高达69万亿美元的外国投资已经成为美国经济的巨大隐患，一旦资本大举撤离，将引发毁灭性的灾难。外资的无情抛弃和顶层的吸血僵化，最终全由底层的普通民众来买单。而与高层那种缺乏活力的安逸形成鲜明对比的是底层务工人员的凄惨境遇。真正的底层劳动者没有任何安全网，连基本的生存都成了奢望。这就是为什么大家现在看到震撼新闻里，美国各大城市街头难民和无家可归者激增的根本原因。根据美国住房和城市发展部2025年发布的最新年度评估报告，全美无家可归者人数达到了创纪录的745652人，其中超过266320人是直接露宿街头，没有任何遮蔽的难民，这比10多年前足足暴增了 27%。 你在洛杉矶和纽约的街头能看到连绵不绝的破败帐篷，底层民怨喧嚣到了极点， 底层民众在长期的高通胀剥削下根本没有积蓄，一旦断供，房子被银行收走，或者交不起高昂的房租，他们就只能流落街头。现在的经济濒临崩溃，底层根本活不起。而面对每天都在激增的绝望群体，统治阶级不仅没有提供实质性的社会救助，反而出台各种严苛的法案，动用警察力量去清理营地，进一步强硬控制任何不稳定因素，试图将贫困和流浪定罪化。这种对底层苦难的系统性漠视与残酷镇压，实在令人心寒，实在是当诛。美国经济的终极底座是美元霸权，但这个底座正在经历不可逆的崩塌。自从美国频繁使用国际资金清算系统进行金融制裁后，全球央行陷入了深度的信用焦虑。武器化美元的后遗症正在全面反噬美国自身，全球南方国家正在加速推进双边本币结算，各国央行连续数年疯狂囤积黄金，系统性的减持美国国债。当海外买家不再像过去那样无底线的接盘美国国债时，美国财政部只能依赖国内资金和美联储自己印钱来消化新发行的天量债券，这最终将彻底摧毁美元的购买力。纵观历史，任何一个依赖无限印钞和武力收割他国财富的帝国，最终都会因为内部的贪婪和产业的空心化而走向灭亡。美国如今的局面，正是过去40年过度金融化所带来的总清算、系统性的贫富分化、残酷的剥削机制、失控的债务洪流，这一切都在昭示着一个不可阻挡的结局。许多研究帝国衰落与宏观经济周期的顶级学者都已经敏锐地察觉到了这种底层逻辑的崩塌。他们指出，当一个国家的财富创造机制被纯粹的金融游戏取代，当其普通民众在生存线上挣扎，而精英阶层却在享受资产泡沫时，这个国家的内部运转就已经宣告死亡。好了，关于这个话题，下面我们来看看理查德·沃尔夫教授的观点。理查德·沃尔夫是美国著名的经济学教授，他在这段演讲中深刻剖析了美国经济衰败的根本原因，明确指出了帝国末路和经济系统性崩溃的必然含义。这与我们今天探讨的美国底层绝望和资本溃逃的现实完全吻合。
Hi everyone and welcome. Today we are joined by the economist, the professor, Richard Wolff. It's fantastic to have you back.
Our debt is now $35 trillion, and our GDP is about $26 or $27 trillion. You see the problem. And a week ago Monday, the Japanese, one of the most docile allies the United States has had since the Second World War, for the first time said, it is too risky. You cannot ask us to lend you more money. I should mention, the United States is the biggest debtor country in the world, and the number one creditor of the United States is Japan. Mr. Trump is desperate, but that's not because Mr. Trump has had something wrong with him. I understand people don't like his style. He is very all over the place. He clearly doesn't understand many of these things. When he first began talking about tariffs, he really said that they would be paid for by the countries that he targeted. He didn't understand that Americans pay a tariff to the American government. That had to be explained to him over and over. And so for me, what I see going on is a desperation that cannot be admitted by the United States. We just had an election between Biden and Trump, and then between Trump and Kamala Harris, in which none of those three presidential candidates said one word about what this underlying problem is. And here it is. The underlying problem is that the American empire is over. The Europeans cannot figure that out. I mean, I watch Macron or Starmer or Friedrich Merz in Germany, or the woman Meloni in Italy. I get a lot of language, but they don't seem to be any more able than the Americans to say what I just said. The empire is doing now what every empire in the world has done. After a period, maybe lasting a century, or maybe two, or maybe even sometimes three, then there comes the peak and then the decline. So the American empire, we all understood, or should have, would eventually turn down. It wasn't a question of whether, it was just a question of when and exactly how. Well, when is now, and how, well, that's what we're watching. And the how now is desperate actions of extreme cutting back of spending and extreme imposing of taxes. And we shouldn't be surprised, because it's all covered over with a denial of the underlying problem, making people desperate, mostly because what they're trying to do doesn't work. And, I don't know, maybe, is it possible that Mr. Trump's policies will somehow work? It's not a zero probability. It could be. I can't predict the future any better than anyone else can, but I wouldn't bet on it. I don't think it's going to work. I think he's going to have more and more disappointment and upset, and he will be busy blaming this scapegoat, that scapegoat, to excuse the fact that it doesn't work. But the irony is, and I say this as a critic of Mr. Trump, that's not his fault. What he's trying to do isn't going to work. One final illustration. Mr. Biden, Mr. Clinton, Mr. Obama, both father and son in the Bush family, all promised in their campaigns for president to bring manufacturing back to the United States. They all promised it. None of them delivered it. Therefore, it would be very naive to believe that Mr. Trump is going to be able to do what none of them were able to do. Is it true that he's going further, going to more extreme efforts? Yes, he is. To his credit, he clearly understood that the others failed. But I must tell you, looking at what he's trying to do, I don't think so. And if I had to point to a single reason, it goes to your question. It's because for the first time in a century, the United States has a serious economic competitor. I like to remind people, and boy, the Europeans seem to need it these days. That may not include the Norwegians, I don't know, but in any case, the GDP of the United States, as I said before, 25, 26, $27 trillion. The GDP of Russia today, maybe 4 trillion. In other words, the United States and Russia were never economic competitors. Russia was much too poor. The notion of the world divided between the United States and Russia was a caricature. Should never have been taken seriously by anybody. Did the Russians have nuclear weapons? Yes. Did that make them a more serious adversary? Yes. But economically, no. That's why even today, these notions that the Russians are the ones that have to be held back, as soon as the war in Ukraine is over, they will be This is the Cold War craziness that has to stop at some point, because it is phony. It is a misunderstanding. And this is not a support for the Russians. I'm not a fan of Mr. Putin or anything like that, but it's just looking at the reality. You can't sustain war without an economic foundation. Every war shows that. The Russians have worked very hard to have a big military, and look at them. Are they winning in Ukraine? Absolutely. Will they win this war? They already have. But it is taking them now 3 years, and they are 10 times the size of Ukraine. And yes, the Ukraine's having a lot of help from the Europeans and the Americans, but nonetheless, look at the limits of what Russia can do. And it has mobilized 1 million people to add to its military in order to fight this war. They can't fight Europe. It's silly. They can't. They can't even fight Ukraine and Poland at the same time, let alone. That's just propaganda, which is so bad that it's being believed even by the people who should know better, because they understand these things. So for me, this is the setting for the so-called trade war. And the most important thing about it, and I say this as an economist, is not this or that tariff. It's the uncertainty. It's the fact that Mr. Trump says it's going to be a tariff, then there isn't one. Now it's 25%. Well, now it's 10%. Now it's 200%. This is impossible. What this does is negate what the whole tariff was supposed to do. I'll give you a simple example. If you're a manufacturer of automobile parts and you have a factory in Mexico, which many of them do, you did that over the last 30 years because of NAFTA, because of the agreement that goods can flow from Mexico into the U.S., like from Canada, into one another of the 3 countries, without a tariff, without any obstacle, free trade. So you could take advantage of the much lower wages in Mexico, produce it there, put it on a truck, and drive it across the border into Texas. No problem. Very profitable. They all did that. Okay, if you put a tariff, which Mr. Trump has said he's going to do, against all goods coming from Mexico into the United States, you're doing away with those profits. And the idea, we're supposed to believe, is that the company with the factory making the goods in Mexico will now move the factory into the United States, making the Mexican workers unemployed and giving jobs to Americans instead. But here's why it won't work. Even if the tariffs stayed in place, the problem is that the American worker remains much higher paid than the Mexican. So how is the American company, or any company, European company, how are they going to make a living because they avoid the tariff, but they have to pay the much higher wages? This is a very iffy proposition. But even that is not the end of the story. The end of the story is you don't know whether this tariff will be in effect next week, next month, next year. And so you're not going to make a very expensive, time-consuming movement of your factory from outside to the United States when there's so much uncertainty. You could end up spending a fortune, move your factory, lose business for 2 years as you move it, only to discover that the tariff that provoked your movement is no longer in place. Why not? Because Mr. Trump is bargaining. He wants benefits And he will, in exchange, get rid of the tariffs or lower them very drastically. Because you don't know. It may be much, much less expensive to pay a 10% tariff than to undertake the movement of a factory, which is very likely to be the case in many, many industries. So all of this is very iffy, very questionable, very much not a cut and dry thing.